We ask, why dwell on the savagery of ancient wars of all things in this enlightened age? The answer is because we haven't changed one bit. It's exactly as it was before. Came out by the same door wherein I went. This is one of the great lessons of the Book of Mormon, that we don't improve, we don't get any better at all, that today most men are as dense as they have ever been, and no matter how far back you go in time, you'll find people just as enlightened as any alive today. The picture never changes, the balance never changes. That's a sweeping statement, but it's true. It's especially illustrated here in the case of war. We were talking about this, and we were using Clausewitz, whose work was published in 1833. He died in 1831, you see. But he was in all the Napoleonic Wars. He was important, and at the end, the last decade of his life, he was the head of the Kriegschule, the war school in Berlin, the Great Prussian War School that made that built up the tremendous Prussian war machine. He was it. And he wrote this classic work, which was in 3 volumes when it came out, on war, and he talks about it. And it's as if Joseph Smith had studied it very carefully. I say 1833, too late for him to get hold of, so we can't accuse him of that. That happens again and again, that Joseph is saved by the bell. You say, well, he got it from this, he got it from that. Mrs. Brodie insists that he got some things from the View of the Indians, though it was written 2 years after the Book of Mormon came out. Joseph Smith stole it from that. Even though it was his, the resemblances are so close we can't deny it, even though it came out after the Book of Mormon. Well, anyway, let's go back to our friend Clausewitz now, and we're quoting him, just as if he was quoting from our present chapter, 49, 48 is chapter 48 in Alma we're talking about here. If in the lower ranks the spirit of self-sacrifice is more required than in others. You regulate the prophecy, the policy. You see, the general is at a distance, and we expect others to sacrifice. Quoting Alma here, the chapters where we are, Amalickiah did not come down out of the land of Nephi at the head of his army. He did not care for the blood of his people. He managed things back there like the modern major general, you see. Such an attitude so shocks Moroni. See, when he writes to Pahoran, can you think to sit on your thrones in a state of plotless stupor while our enemies spreading the work of death around you? Yes, we can think of it. That's the way we do things. We don't care for the lives of those on the front. That's true. After all, only 8% of the armed forces saw action in World War II. But the other 92% were necessary. All they were a backup for the whole thing. The whole purpose of the Army is that cutting edge, search and destroy, and everything else is a backup for that. So they're all in it together as far as that goes. But they don't consider one of the most striking things. About 2 o'clock in the morning one night, I had a little tent on the Dutch Canal. It was down there, and I was marking a map in it, and the tent was over a foxhole. There was a terrific racket on the canal down the way. All these Bren guns, all these British guns were suddenly opening up. They were just blasting away. Wonder what that was. Somebody trying to cross the canal, obviously, because they were on the other side, you see. I mean, the so-called enemy were on the other side. In a few minutes, into my test burst some kid dressed like a Dutch worker, all soaking wet. He just swum the canal with all those guns blazing at him, and he got across, and he flopped down on the straw in the tent. We had it paved with straw, the foxhole. And all he could do was just, for a minute or two, all he could do was say, I know there's a God, I know there's a God, I know there's a God. And well, what's wrong? Yes, we know there's a God. And so forth. Well, he just swam the canal, you see. But he was in the medics, and he'd been captured, and he'd been on the other side, and the Germans had shifted them around with groups and all. They had the upper hand all around, see. They'd shifted him around with groups. He pretended to be deaf and dumb. He'd point to his mouth where he went. But he observed very carefully wherever he went. All this side of him by Elst, they'd marched from all over the place, and he got away, and then he'd swum the canal, and he comes back loaded with this information. So I trotted right over to Major Danaher and said, look, this kid knows everything. And so they immediately got him out and whipped him. I said, this is going to get you a promotion. You'll get a 3-week furlough, everything for this. They'll really reward you for this. And so he went with his information. They took him clear back to Brussels, and I think a lot of officers got promoted on the strength of his discoveries, intelligence officers. And later, I saw him months later, about 4 or 5 months later, in Namur, I said, did you ever get your 3 weeks pass? He said, I didn't get one pass at all. Had to go right back the next day. See, they didn't care about him. He provided them with all this information, which was invaluable, and I say, which I'm pretty sure fired a number of promotions and got nothing for it. Well, why should he? I mean, he has to go back again. This goes again and again. This is notorious in armies, as he says, you see. In the lower ranks, the spirit of self-sacrifice is more required. And so Malachi, the same thing, you see. Then he goes on with the third rule, good old Clausewitz. We can never introduce a modifying principle into the philosophy of war without committing an absurdity. War is war, you see, the point is. He says, war is an act of force. There is no limit to the application of force. To talk about civilized warfare and rules of warfare is ridiculous. If you're civilized, you don't start swinging and scratching and biting and gouging eyes and all that sort of thing. You do everything you can to hurt the other person. That's the idea. You're no longer discussing things. You're no longer civilized at all. Instead of continuing the discussion, you see. And you try to kill the other person. There's no limit to that. So he says, well, he says to introduce, you see, a modifying principle is an absurdity. You can't modify it. There's no limit to the application of force once that's the policy. Alma puts it very well when he says they had exhausted all resources, and he says, whatever evil we cannot resist with our words, then let us resist them with our swords. If words won't cut it, then swords will cut it, you see. Then when you start swinging swords, you're not particular, you see. You're not careful not to hurt anybody, you see. You're all out once you're drunk. But he says, hold out with the words as long as you can. This is, whatever evil we cannot resist with our words, then let us resist them with our swords. There are no more rules. And the Lord says the frequent expression, cursed shall be the land, Alma 45, we just passed that, unto destruction. It goes on, it doesn't stop until that. So brushfire wars are out of the question, but at the end of World War II, the generals were very discouraged. There was a gloom. Right at the end, I was transferred to the 6th Army Group, General Devers in Heidelberg. That was the big headquarters, and it's an Army Group headquarters. See, I had to make out the daily intelligence report there. That was a busy job. But you could cut the gloom with a knife. The war was winding down too fast. It meant the end of quick promotions. It meant the slowing down of careers. They thought some of them would have to be out of the Army altogether and go back to selling washing machines, so they were colonels and so forth now. And it had been a lark for most of them. Of course it had. But then they discovered the concept of brush fire wars. I remember it was General Taylor more than anyone else, back at division now. When he burst in one day in high glee, he'd been over to Washington, he was back, and he was so excited he could hardly contain himself because they had discovered the concept of brush fire wars. It was and he was more responsible for taking up the war in Korea and in Vietnam than anyone else, because he was chief of staff, you see, at the time of Korea. But this time he was only a major general, head of the division. But he brush fire wars. We can always have these little wars where we can go in and mop up, we can get our promotions, we can get our practice, we can keep in drill, we can always keep pressure on Congress for more money and so forth, because these are going on. It's ideal. We could have these little wars going on. No great risk. We couldn't lose very much. Good practice to send out officers to get practice and so forth, but it doesn't work that way. And Clausewitz says why it doesn't work that way. He says, this is a quotation, it's a very good one. He says, war and peace are ideas which fundamentally can have no gradations. You can't say there's a little war and a bigger war and a bigger war and a bigger war. Once it starts, it's all out, you see. And he goes on, he says, we must never lose sight of the absolute form of war. War is an absolute. See, you don't have it in degrees. You can't have a little one. Just as you can slightly murder a person, or a person can be slightly pregnant, or something like that. It doesn't go that way. You go all the way in these things. He says, rather, the image of absolute war must constantly hover in the background. Yeah, it's going to be absolute. And this is the Book of Mormon, see. Nephi says after one of their great victories in Alma 45, a chapter we just passed, Alma 45, we began with 46. We should have begun with 45, you see, because we didn't get up there last semester. He tells us, I perceive, after a great victory, in fact, their greatest victory, Alma announced to the people, I perceive that this very people, the Nephites, shall become extinct. That's putting it pretty strong, you see. This sort of thing goes all the way. So good old Clausewitz continues, In pursuing the aim of war, there is only one means, combat. I say it's search and destroy. 92%, they're all backing it up. The whole effort is what happens on the front, the zone of contact there. And all effects are manifested in war have their origin in combat. Well, that's what it is, naturally. Moroni in combat returns the sword to Zerahemnah. Zerahemnah didn't want to discuss it. Zerahemnah had surrendered, but he was still defiant. And so Moroni gives him to go, if you're not going to talk, then here's your sword back. Let's continue to fight. And that's the only solution, unless you choose to make the covenant. And he invited to take him back and continue, but he was doing it only as a trick. Zerahemnah was, as we shall presently see. Unless you choose to make a covenant of peace, you just have to go on fighting. Military combat is the only effective way, the pursuance of only one means. All effects, says good old Clausewitz, manifested in war have their origin in combat. And so, as Moroni hands Zerahemnah his sword back again in Alma 44:10-11, he says the only reason, he says, we will end the conflict. If you don't want to discuss it, we'll end it, and so we will fight it out. He invites him to do that. Now, the only reason for suspension of military action, I'm quoting Clausewitz again, the only reason for suspending action, for stopping the fighting, is to await for a more favorable moment to attack, you see. Things aren't going your way, so you want to stop fighting for a while and recoup your gains and so forth. This is, when Zerahemnah put up his sword, he was merely waiting for a favorable time to strike back. He tells Moroni quite frankly to hand him back his sword, and then he adds, we will not suffer ourselves to take an oath to you which we know we shall break. Zerahemnah's at least that honest. He says, I'm not going to take an oath because you know I'll break it, I know I'll break it. And then he gets his sword back, and as soon as he got it back, he made a surprise lunge for Alma. Before anybody was expecting, you see, he suspended action for a more favorable moment for attack. So he held it up, and they were discussing things. He took his sword back, and then he takes a pass at Alma, where instantly Alma's bodyguard takes a swab at him and cuts off the top of his skull. And he goes off, lives the rest of his life, missing his roof there. We don't hear of him again. He may not have lived very long, I don't know. But he could have had a brass plate or something put in. They did in those days. And that's Alma 44:12, that happens. So the lull in the battle is the time to be scary. The fatal mistake at Anzio, they landed at Anzio. See, they were going to do this in January 1944. They're going to leapfrog, so they landed at Anzio in General Scott, the 32nd Texas Division, and they didn't find any opposition. There were just 2 German battalions there. Germans never expected that. They were caught completely by surprise. Well, it was marvelous. But what did Scott do? The most foolish thing in the world. He said, well, it's calm now. I'm going to wait here for a few weeks to build up my forces. I have real strength, and then lunge inland. That's what they were going to do. Well, the minute Hitler heard about that, he sent everything he had down to Anzio. He just built up, and they just pushed them back into the sea again, nearly wiped them out completely. Because he waited and waited. He said, well, more fatal action, you see. I say, when things are quiet, that's the time to be scared. And that was the fatal mistake. And again from Clausewitz, the destruction of the enemy's armed forces is the foundation stone of all actions in war, the ultimate support of all combinations. That's, I say, you're 92%, your backup. The ultimate support of all combination is the destruction of the enemy's armed forces. Well, that's what it comes down to. That's why military careers run in families. You see, they do. You see, anyone who's a member of the has always been an army brat ancestry. That's almost invariably the rule. Those who reach high command. And they have no illusions either. The best sermons you'll ever hear against war and the cruelty and brutality of it come from generals. I mean, Taylor, after every operation, would deplore what had happened. This is a ghastly thing. Why do we have to be into this? But this thing is passed down in the family, and so it gets to be quite a respectable, taken for granted sort of thing. It doesn't turn their stomach anymore. It's the way you live. It's that sort of thing. For anybody else to come in cold out of something else, for a civilian to come in cold and suddenly see people gouging eyes out and things like that, it's pretty horrifying. That's the Vietnam experience, you see, because they were brought in so suddenly. And the theme is destruction. And the armed forces today, of course, extend to everybody because it's the nation in arms with Napoleon. 1850, that's why he said Napoleon is the real war master. He's the one that gave us war in its purity, he says. The gentlemen's wars that were fought in Napoleon's days still, but now everybody gets wiped out. The word destruction and destroy appears 534 times in the Book of Mormon. Destruction is a theme, and nearly always it's in connection with the word war. Well, but why with war? We're told that war and plagues and pestilence and famine all go together. But wars are the part you bring on yourself. You can't plead innocent victim as you can of famine or plague. You just happen. You invite war. The Army is always told that our mission, I say, is to search and destroy. So Clausewitz says, quote, "The soldier is levied, clothed, armed, trained. He sleeps, eats, drinks, and marches for one purpose only, merely to fight at the right place and the right time." It's the only reason for his existence, justified at a particular time and place. He has the idea that that's his only purpose anyway, you see. So you can see why the higher brass don't care much. They live in considerable luxury, but the rest of them don't. There's a famous poem about Frederick the Great at Battle of Jena. One battle or the other, one of the worst ones, and they were getting it hit very hot and heavy. One of the Reason Regiment, his guard, which he was so proud, started falling back under terrific hail of pressure. And Frederick rode up in front of him and said, "Ihr verfluchter Kerls, this is treason." He says, you're running away. Whereupon one of them says, "I Fritzl nicht von Betrug, der 14 Pfennig is heute genug." Impression. Fritzl, they call affectionate term, little Fritz. "Fritz, this is not treason. I've had enough today for 14 cents. 14 pennies is what they got paid, 14 pennies a day. That's all you got paid, of course." And he says, for 15, I've had enough for 14, I've had my 14 pennies worth today. So he's running away for 14 pennies. This 14 pennies is what you can do. So that's the difference. And of course, it's an enormous difference. I don't know whether I should tell. Well, there are too many stories I shouldn't tell, but this is one that's a good one. I won't tell it, though. In World War II, as I say, well, and so quoting Clausewitz again, "If we speak of destruction of the enemy's forces, we must expressly point out that nothing obliges us to confine this idea to physical forces. The whole thing is to break his will. If he's willing to surrender, then the war's over. That's all you want, is to have him do what you want to do. Your will dominates over his, and you know the Prussian, the Kriegsführer, the German, the Generalstab, the whole theory is will. Wille, and it's the German philosophy. The philosopher that took them to that more than anyone else was it Tegel? Again, one of those things, I'll think of it in a second. But they're always talking about will, the Germans, the iron will, the will that dominates everything. Hitler was obsessed with that idea. It's the German Deutsche Wille that wins through and everything. And it's Schopenhauer's Die Welt ist meine Vorstellung, the title of his great work, The World as Wille, and so forth. The will is everything. And he says, whole thing is to dominate the enemy's will. Once you've done that, you see, you won. So the psychological part is very necessary. We try to break the enemy down psychologically as well, but of course it was Clausewitz who introduced the doctrine of Schrecklichkeit, and this is marvelous in the Book of Mormon. This comes out beautifully. Remember how the Lamanites would get themselves up in this fierce, paint their faces red, wear skins, lamb skins around their loins, and make themselves as ferocious as possible, shave their heads. He introduced Schrecklichkeit, and that means making yourself as terrible as possible, Schrecken. Hitler's saying used to be, lieber ein schreckliches Ende als ein End ohne Schrecken. Als ein Schrecken ohne End. Schreck ohne End. Better a terrible ending than a terror without ending. See, better a terrible ending. So that he plunges into it. Better a terrible ending than to live in a terror without ending. This is the excuse. But Schrecklichkeit is be terrible. Make yourself as terrible as possible. Intimidate the enemy. Do everything you can. This is became an important German technique, important in the Blitzkrieg. When it breaks out, you have to be absolutely overpowering. Show yourself to be unmerciful. Go through anything, just wipe them out and so forth. And look terrible. Make yourself look as impressive and terrible as possible. And so you get all this with bells jingling and drums and all this chanting together and so forth. The old Germanic tradition you see here. That's a tradition to keep things alive. It's not just, well, it is profits because it's for loot. And that's pushed behind it in the modern world too. But they had that war spirit. They loved it, you see. Some people just love that sort of thing. It is fun. This is a thing that's terrible to admit, but it is exhilarating. Damn it, compared with other things, there's nothing like it. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. And that keeps us getting us. There must be another form of exhilaration. Of course, there is, of course. Remember? To be carnally minded is death. Be spiritually minded is life eternal. This is being carnal-minded at its peak. Everything is physical, everything is raw, everything is violent. But the mental side of it, and that's what, this is an interesting phenomenon. This one thing, I've never talked about war in this class before, but this one thing I have told, namely that I had the privilege of entering certain villages where I had tractors. See, I took my bicycle out. President Tadji was very indulgent, and all along the Rhine there, in those Rhine villages in the Rhine plain, I would take my trusty bicycle on the Vosges and go out and track in the villages all alone. And it was hard. It was grim. The Calvinist villages were the toughest. The Catholics were the next, and the Lutherans were rather kind. But it was rough. But it was a clash of minds, you see, because immediately these people were tremendously hostile. I went through the same village with an M1 dashing from door to door. Well, I rather used a carbine. It was lighter. Dashing from door to door. And so much easier that it was. I would think time and again, this is so much easier than trying to confront these people eye to eye and eyeball to eyeball. Shooting at a distance was much nicer, much safer, you see, as far as that goes. It reminds me of something that happened in Karlsruhe. We haven't got over this, you see. There was one place when I was on my mission, I was a short time during a conference in Karlsruhe, and I went and tracked it along right by the big church where there's a main street, and it parts there, and it leads out to the Odenwald, the forest there. And there was this butcher shop there. I went to the butcher shop, and I started giving my voice of warning. And a woman who's a gigantic Hessian woman, she had a fit. She ran to the back of the shop and came out with a huge cleaver. Don't you tell me we'll ever be destroyed. Don't you tell me. Because I had told her on impulse what Brother Ballard told me when he set me apart for the mission. He says, tell these people that they will be destroyed by fire from heaven, of all the strange things to tell them. And I told her that, fire from heaven. Well, a year later, I drove by, late at night, I was driving by, and officer, I think it was Van Petten, was with me. See, officers couldn't drive Jeeps. I could. I had my own Jeep. That was great. And was driving down the same street in Karlsruhe in a bright moonlight. It was all ruins. It was all ruination. It had all just been wiped out by firebombs from the English planes. They just wiped it out. Fire from heaven destroyed them. And suddenly I ground to a halt, jammed on the brakes. He said, what's wrong? They were right in front of that shop. That's the butcher shop where the women came out raving, waving the cleaver and yelling, don't you tell us we'll ever be destroyed by fire from heaven. And all you could see was the framework of the door there. But it was the old butcher shop. It was complete ruin. It had been burnt out totally. You see. So these things are fulfilled. I mean, we're not living a million miles away from the Book of Mormon here. It's disturbing. But of course, our weapons are more efficient now. We wouldn't have left the door frame standing today. But anyway, this Schrecklichkeit's a big thing. Making yourself an object of utter terror is beautifully described in the Book of Mormon. Or on various occasions, in Enos 1 and 20, Mosiah 10 and 8, Alma 3, 4, 5, and so forth. Also, the Gadiantons in their various trappings make themselves look very ferocious. And they make themselves and their uniforms as hideously powerful, like the trappings of the barons of Middle Ages when they wanted to keep the peasants in their place, like the Ku Klux Klan. They made themselves look hideous and mysterious. The German word for enemy is Feind, which is our word for fiend, you see. And the same thing in that, our word for hostile. Host is the same word as host, and the same word as ghost, you see. A ghost is someone from an alien being from elsewhere. A host is someone who receives someone. A guest, the same word guest is the same word as ghost, you see. These are all cognate. So the guest comes in, and he is a stranger from abroad. The guest, the ghost, the host, and he's also hostile because there's strange, this alienation. So find, the German word for enemy, is the same word for fiend. You see, it's someone of an alien spirit, someone out of your world. It's the satanic host. In the Middle Ages, of course, they get themselves up in these tremendous outfits, cover themselves completely in these enormous antlers or horns or wings, mostly antlers and horns, and make themselves look absolutely hideous and were objects of terror when they ride through the land to each other and everybody else. The chivalric trappings, because they were orders, they were mysteries. To wear that outfit, you had to belong to a mystery, and that was your sign. Well, the order, the Teutonic Order, it begins, you see, begins at the Temple, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Knights of Rhodes, the Knights of Malta, and finally you go up in the Baltic, the Jomsburg, And they were all secret organizations, and they were all exceedingly rich, and they all plundered, and they did all this sort of thing. They made a mystery and a cult of war. This is the point. But this part of it is still there, because they're the only people that still wear special uniforms. They don't dress like anybody else. They set themselves apart from the rest of the society, and they don't think like other people either. You don't expect them to. Those things you expect of them. So, well, these shows we put on, they're not very impressive. On July the 4th, to celebrate, in 44, they had over 5,000 planes fly over Normandy, all in one body, all in one bunch. They flew right over us, and the peasants looked up for a minute or two, and that was all. They weren't impressed. Those things aren't impressive at all, these things. Special effects just won't cut it. That's all there is to it. The real thing is what counts, and that's to be spiritual-minded. That's when you know what's real. Well, anyway, as Tolstoy tells us, war is a crashing bore. All night long you pray for it to be day, all day long you pray for it to be night. And that's the whole thing. But you can use Schrecklichkeit to make soldiers an object of terror. We mentioned that. And it didn't work. The Nephites went down on their knees and started praying, and the Ammonites thought, aha, it's our terrible appearance. It's absolutely paralyzed them. We look so terrible, but it wasn't that. They said, you must be kidding. You say, we were just praying. This is the positive action, not defensive. The armies of Gideonhi, with red on their foreheads, lambskins on their loins, and all that nonsense, they thought they were praying because their fierce appearance paralyzed the Nephites, but it was only because of supplicating the Lord for his protection. That's in 3rd Nephi. We'll get to that yet. There's a fourth point, the one on which Clausewitz lays a very heavy emphasis, namely this. There is no other human activity that stands in such constant and universal contact with chance as does war. That's his main principle. He who undertakes war must renounce every absolute certainty of result. You never know how any operation is going to turn out. I was briefed up to the eyebrows for months on what the Operation Overlord would be in Normandy. I had to go down and brief every company just before when they were all in the marshalling area and nothing could leak out. Then I had to go, and my business was to tell each company what they were supposed to do and what they would be running into, what they could expect. I wouldn't tell them the time and the place exactly, but even though that was what the general told me to do, and it was a painful assignment going down to all of them. And the idea was I should know what was going to happen, and nothing happened. I can say that nothing happened as it was planned or expected on D-Day. And that's the only thing that saved us. When the whole company of the 52nd was dropped 55 miles away from their targets. Well, that was absurd, but it was the one thing that won the day, because the Germans wondered, what in the devil are those people doing? What's their plan? Because they had our plan absolutely down cold. The first person that came in said, he came out from behind a hedge with his arms up, happily smiling. He said, why didn't you come yesterday? We were expecting you yesterday. And then I very quickly got a mimeographed order that had come from they were the 909th, that was it was a holding division on the coast, the Coastal Defense Division. And there was the plan, all laid out exactly as we were going to do it, but it was for the day before, for June the 5th. But it was the weather that forced us to change. It wrecked our plans, but it wrecked their plans too. But I mean, when you start landing whole companies 55 miles away, they don't know what you're up to. They don't know where to concentrate their forces to counterattack. They don't know what you're doing. We landed all sorts of things, and the whole thing was that way. I mean, everything was missed. Nothing turned out, and I say that's what saved it. It was Hitler that won in Normandy, of course. He had, all the armored forces he needs. He was holding panzer divisions back in Paris there because he was absolutely determined that we were going to invade on the Havre Peninsula. And we had an awful plan for invading. The original one was Operation Reinking, and it was to invade Le Havre on March the 15th. And it was absolute suicide. Everybody heaved an enormous sigh of relief when it was called off. It was all, the general, of course, had to put on an act, though. He turned over the sand table, he threw down his hat, he stamped on it to show his indignation, and he was so gung-ho, he had to go through with this operation, which I say was absolute suicide. But but when it did go off, you see, Hitler thought we were going to land in the Havre, and he kept everything back. No, we're going to send it to the Havre. You just wait till it happens, and that gave us a chance to get a hold. Otherwise, with the greatest of ease, they could have pushed us back into the sea with no problem at all, because for a whole week after landing, we got no supplies at all because of the awful weather. It was horrible. Well, anyway, we find here examples in Alma. Alma 49. Well, it's the next chapter here. Here's a good example where we have some in the 49th chapter of Alma. He brings some out. I think that's, yeah. Yes, notice. The Lamanites, very clever. They had the Zoramite commanders. They knew everything that was going on and so forth. But how great was they supposed there would be an easy prey for them. Notice, they supposed the city of Ammonihah would be an easy prey for them. But behold, how great was their disappointment. Didn't turn out that way at all. Behold, the Nephites had dug a ridge. And then notice, 5th verse. Now at the time, the chief captain of the Lamanites were astonished exceedingly. Things weren't going their way at all, but astonished. The only rule, Napoleon says, a general must never be surprised. Well, our generals are always being surprised, and so was Napoleon. I mean, surprise is the main element. That's what strategy is, to achieve surprise. Overwhelming strength at a particular time and place when you're not expected. There you have your chance. So they're exceedingly surprised, the greatness of their numbers. They had also prepared themselves with shields and so forth. Notice the 8th verse again. Behold, to their utter astonishment, they were prepared for them in a manner which had never been known among the children of Nephi. There's the genius of Moroni. He did something new. He did something surprising. And that's what makes a great commander, to have ideas of his own and to think of something new. And that's what makes the army such a drag, because they always fight the last war. You see, I told you about General Colonel Coles, who insisted on a bayonet charge, because that's the kind they had in the First World War, the bayonet charge on the bridge at Carentan. The same Colonel Coles that went off to take Sertogenbusch single-handed and so forth. He insisted on fighting the First World War. Well, they all did, as a matter of fact, because it's the only war they knew. That's the textbook they had to follow. You like to talk about it and correct your errors, give us another chance. They regard the next war as giving them another chance, but it isn't. It's a totally different ball game, technically, because, well, geographically and everything else. And so here we have it. Coriantumr marches right into the center of it. This is a good example in Helaman here. Coriantumr rides him right into the center of Zarahemla, the capital city of Bountiful, and he took it, catching the Nephites off guard, surprised the Nephites. But in the end, he'd caught himself in a trap. The reason they had been expecting him on the outside, and they had a protective curtain around the city on the outside, so he was trapped once he got in there. He had to surrender. He'd been surrounded. See? Everybody surprises everybody else. When he tried to get out of the land, he found the Nephites had pulled all their defenses on the periphery, and he couldn't get out. That's the first chapter of Helaman. Everybody surprises everybody else in war. Nobody is sure of anything. And so he makes this statement, a famous statement these are all famous statements of Clausewitz. Warfare is therefore a chameleon, Clausewitz explains, a strange trinity. 3 things make it up. It's composed of, first, the original violence of its essence. Secondly, the hate and enmity, which are to be regarded as blind natural impulse. See how important it was for Malachi to take a few months stirring up hate, national passion here for a war, because the people couldn't get it otherwise. And thirdly, the play of probabilities and chance, which make a free activity of emotions. In other words, war is a madhouse. Everything on the land, based on the windmill near St. Mariglis. There was a windmill there. St. Mariglis was the first town taken. That was by the headquarters company, the one I was in. And this windmill, I have to brief all these on the windmill and so on. And of course, you know what happened. They went over and bombed the daylights out of it before we came, and there was no windmill. It absolutely disappeared, of course. Yet everything was to be judged by the windmill. Look for the windmill. There was no windmill. This, I say, is absolutely typical, as he says here, the strange trinity. Those climactic pages of Mormon describe the final wind-up. Mormon prays for God to destroy his own people if they don't change their ways. They're so hopeless. I saw that the day of grace was past with them, he says. The Nephites had reached the point of no return. Mormon simply wished them to get it over with. There's nothing more terrifying nor more vivid or to the point. Like today's wars in Lebanon and Central America. They're madhouses, they're crazy scenes. War of all branches of activity, quoting Clausewitz again, is most like a game of cards. Again, only in Hollywood are we absolutely sure that the good guys will win. The quintessential plot of the John Wayne is vengeance, and he always gets up with the bad guys, and of the Green Beret and all those things. This is the theme. One of the most famous phrases coined by Clausewitz, next to the one on war is the war on politics, is that war is politics rather means the second most famous phrase is 3/4 of the things upon the action of war is calculated lie hidden in a fog of uncertainty. This is the famous fog of battle. You never know what's going to happen. It's like Marshal Saxe, a story that getting prepared for one operation, he gathered us around in a ring, General Taylor Max, and he says, you want to know where you're going? Well, he says, once Marshal Saxe, he was the great general who won the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. He used to change. Well, in the wars of succession in the mid 18th century, there were professional armies and generals there, but it was just shifting sides back and forth. There were like a lot of mercenaries. But Marshal Saxe was going to lead this great thing. It was into Fontenoy, and one of them says he was briefing the officers before the battle, and one of them said, rather amused, Marshal, your knees are knocking together. And he said, yes, they'd knock a lot harder if they knew where I was taking you. But by a coincidence, I found out later on, when Taylor told us that story, that the very place he was taking them was where Taylor was taking us. I don't know whether he knew that or not. That's the very place where we were going in the lowlands, right down in Zone there, right in Brabant. That's where we're going to land, on the sand there. And his knees are walking together because you don't know what's going to happen, you see. Then, so when the battle begins, nobody knows anything. The general loses attack. Did you see the front page today, for example, to show how our technical advantages change everything? Don't change anything. The Atlantis shuttle has been delayed again, indefinitely delayed. Why? Well, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars. They have a huge staff of well-trained scientists and so forth working on it. They've been months planning this takeoff, and now they have to call it off for a while because the computer isn't working. Now, if you don't think that could happen in the war, you're very much mistaken, you see. The computers don't always work, but after all that, you see, the computer isn't working, so they can't send it yet. And it's the same thing here. I was attached to the British Second Army in this thing they call the Operation Market Garden when they went up to Arnhem. And within a week or 10 days at the most, they threw away all their automatic weapons. Their were no good at all. They had the Bren guns, the Woolworth guns. We had a Brownings and everything. They were no good. They were all full of mud and sand. The barrels were all jammed. They just threw them away. And they did. They went back to sticks, stones, and rifles, the usual thing. But no more automatic weapons. Nothing would work. So we always go back to primitive war. And a very bad night at a place called St. Odenrode, where there was a castle, a 14th century castle that Louis XIV had refurbished as a rest home for his officers up in the Netherlands. See, everybody was always trying to take the Netherlands. See, the Netherlands are the cockpit of Europe. And this is where all the battles take place. These are the planes that you roll into Germany, into France, depending on which way you go, into Holland, into Belgium. And so it's always the Netherlands, always has been. And this was there. And what was I going to say? Well, I can quote some Shakespeare at this point. Look, he gives the best account of war of anyone, far better than anyone else. When Green says Shakespeare is the best historian, he's quite correct. And so he tells us before the battle of Agincourt, the great Agincourt, Henry V, for the Battle of Agincourt, and that's a tremendous thing. Because they won against the most appalling odds, was in 1415. That was a long time ago. But the picture hasn't changed at all. So here you are in the lowlands of northern of France and the Netherlands. They go together, of course. The Netherlands were France time. And Henry V's come over and his army. And they, now entertain conjecture of a time when creeping murmur and the pouring dark fill the wide vessel of the universe. Creeping murmur and the pouring. Isn't that good at night over this flat countryside, the heavy trees and this, that, and the other, and the farms, when creeping murmur and the pouring dark fill the wide vessel of the universe. From either camp, through the foul womb of night, smoke and stench, you say, through the foul womb of night, the hum of either army stilly sounds. that the fixed sentinels almost receive the secret whispers of the other's watch. See, it's so still, you can hear either army, notice the hum of either army, that's what they're all subdued at night, dimly sounds, stilly sounds, that the fixed sentinels almost receive the secret whispers of each other watch. You can almost hear the passwords on the other side, they're so close. Then fire answers fire, and in there, and through the paly flames, and here it is again, each battle, that's battalion, each battle sees the other's umbered face. I told you the armies look exactly alike, and they do. And in the stilly fires, their camps are so much alike, the other army is your own. You see, each army sees the other's umbered face. Faces are blackened. And so it happens here. Steed threatens steed in high and boastful neigh, piercing the night's dull ear. And, well, you're not going to have steeds, and you're not going to have armors, but you see, and from the tents, the armorers accomplishing their knights. That means outfitting the lords, because they're going to be on it the next day. Boy, are they going to lose that battle. Outfit, they're 10-to-1 superiority too. The knights accomplishing their knights with busy hammers, closing rivets up, give dreadful note of preparation. What's going to happen tomorrow? All this clank, clank, clanking. Now, we didn't hear the neigh of horses, but you could hear the roll of motors. We were so close, you see, you would lie there, there's the damp, flat land with a ground fog over it. On the one side was the Vaal, this huge extent of river, great extent of water. As it goes down toward the sea, there's this vast sheet of water, and on the other, the British artillery all on the other side. And on the other was the Rhine, we were caught between them, and all these canals and the ground fogs, and the sound would carry miraculously night, so you could lie there and listen, and you could hear them, the Germans moving in and so forth. You couldn't hear the armors clanking with their hammers, but you could hear very clearly the tanks moving in. They're clanking into position, and the Germans made discs. They made phonograph discs, which they would amplify and beam in our direction. You see, we'd get the impression that whole armies were moving in. You see, you could hear all this yelling and all these trucks, and so some of it was real and some of it was fake, but you could hear it very plainly. So you could hear the clank of armor just as you could hear the clank of armor then. And you could hear even coughs sometimes when it was very still, but then most of the time it was terribly noisy. But then what happens? Oh yes. And then there's a homely touch, you see, because there was a farm, I was stuck for so long, there was a farm right next door, and they had turkeys and chickens, and it was very homely. They carried on life as usual. You see, this is an interesting thing. And so it says, the country cocks do crow, the clocks do toll, and the third hour of drowsy morning name. You see, it's getting along, you see. The homely, you never guess where you were if you hear the country clocks, country cocks crowing and the clocks tolling. Proud of their numbers, now here's the French, proud of their numbers and secure in soul, the confident and overlusty French do the low-rated English play at dice. You notice Shakespeare introduces terms that were never used before and we've used ever since. He has done more for the language, of course, than any other. He and the English Bible framed the language. Notice he's talking about low-rated, things that sound so very modern, and overconfident. The French were overconfident, and the English were rated too low, just like teams in the league, you see. And they were taking bets on how the battle would go in the next morning, and trying to pass the night. Nobody was sleeping, you see. And chide the crippled, tardy-gated knight, who, like a foul and ugly witch, doth limp so tediously away, will it never be morning. The poor condemned English, like sacrifices by their watchful fires, sit patiently and inward ruminate the morning's danger. You can bet they would, you see. I mean, outnumbered hopelessly the way they were. And they're, and they're sad guys, oh yes. It's sad, and what does it do? Oh yes, investing what is it? Their sad manner in investing lean, lank lean cheeks and war-worn coats. They've had a long campaign and they're just bushed, you see. Lean, lank, had nothing to eat. Lean, lank cheeks and war-worn coats. Presenteth them unto the gazing moon so many horrid ghosts. That's what they look like. Oh, now who will behold. Now we have an essay on leadership. This is the great leader was Henry V. They say he would have been England's greatest king if he had lived, but he died quite young, just 6 years after this happened. Oh, now who will behold now who will behold the royal captain of this ruined band, walking from watch to watch and tent to tent. Let him cry praise and glory on his head. For forth he goes and visits all his hosts, bids them good morrow with a modest smile, and calls them brothers, friends, and countrymen. Upon his royal face there is no note how dread an army has surrounded him. He says enrounded him, how dread an army. He doesn't indicate fear at all. It's what he has to do. He keeps up the morale of everybody, you see. How dread an army. Nor doth he dedicate one jot of color unto the weary and all watched night. He hasn't slept. He's been up all night, but he doesn't dedicate one jot of color to that. He's just as cheerful, but cheerful. But well, what does he do? One jot of color, but he uses cheerful in the next line. Oh yes. He looks rested and cheerful and overbids a taint. Overbids a taint would need some explanation. That means by sheer willpower, he overcomes all temptation to yield and go to sleep or relax. He just holds himself in with an iron will, you see. Is it cheerful, the word he uses? No, he uses cheerful in the next one. With cheerful semblance and sweet majesty. Cheerful semblance. He's cheerful. He's putting it on, of course. It's semblance. It's cheerful. Because to keep everybody's morale up. That every wretch pining and pale before, beholding him, plucks comfort from his looks. Thawing cold fear. Yeah. Comes comfort from his looks, thawing cold fear. And then it says then behold, it says, if unworthiness may present, he says, if unworthiness, not define, yes. If may unworthiness define a little touch of Harry in the night, you see. Behold, oh yes, then I've got it now. Then mean and gentles all, behold, if may unworthiness define a little touch of Harry in the night. See, I'm unworthy of displaying this. And then he points, and then there's a dumb scene showing Henry going around visiting the troops and seeing this sort of thing. And then that's the one that ends by saying, sit and see, minding true things by what their mockeries be. So he's the true leader. See, he goes around and he's everywhere and cheering everybody up, never letting on and so forth. And it did pay off. And then at the end, the only one who pays off is the Duke of Burgundy. The Duke of Burgundy is the Constable of France, and he's the peacemaker. He brings Henry and Charles VI of France together, and in a marvelous speech he tells them, you see, he tells them, I brought you together royal, face to face and eye to eye. And he says, in that case, should I be disgraced to suggest peace might be a good idea? He says, why should not peace, why should not why should not the mangled peace, the poor, why should not the poor outcast and mangled peace, dear nurse of all the arts, plenties, and happy births, why should she not raise her face, show her face again in this, our fertile France, it says, in this garden of all the earth, why shouldn't we have gentle peace again in this garden of the earth, our fertile France? Why do we just tear it up? Well, Henry took things over, but he soon died, and Charles VI went mad the same year, And the one who was in charge of everything was Burgundy, Duke of Burgundy. So it was the peaceful man that won after all. He got enormous gain by that, Burgundy. Well, so it goes. And oh my land, the time is up. Too much time groping for lost words, isn't it? That's what happens with old age. So from day to day we ripe and ripe, and then from day to day we rot and rot.